The story begins in stillness. A light breeze moves through a bamboo forest, and the faint sound of distant water creates a rhythm that feels eternal. In this world of measured silence, the figure of the samurai appears, poised, graceful, untouchable. His hand rests on the hilt of a blade that gleams like frozen light. He stands not as a man but as an ideal, the living image of control, honor, and serenity. Generations have worshipped this image, poets, painters, even modern filmmakers, shaping the samurai into a symbol of perfection. Yet beneath that perfection lies something far more disturbing, something Japan's warrior class never intended to be seen. Behind every gesture of calm, every bow, every breath of discipline, existed a universe of psychological torture so refined, so methodical, that it blurred the line between enlightenment and insanity. This illusion of serenity was no accident. The samurai were not merely soldiers. They were spiritual weapons forged through fear, silence, and shame. From childhood, boys born into warrior families were stripped of comfort and affection. The first lesson was not swordsmanship but endurance. They were taught never to cry, never to tremble, and above all, never to reveal pain. To show emotion was to dishonor one's ancestors, a sin worse than death itself. The young trainees were watched constantly, their masters studying every flicker of expression, every hesitation, every sign of weakness. Each moment of vulnerability became an opportunity for correction. A slap, a cut, or a night left kneeling on cold stone floors. The discipline that outsiders admired as elegance was, in truth, a system of psychological control designed to crush individuality and replace it with obedience. In the hidden dojos of feudal Japan, serenity was a mask, and behind it burned terror. Masters often reminded their students that a true warrior must die before he dies. The phrase sounded poetic, but its meaning was far darker. To die before dying meant to undergo an internal death, the destruction of fear, desire, and emotion, until nothing human remained. Meditation was not a gentle act of peace, it was a mental battlefield. Students were ordered to sit motionless for hours, sometimes in freezing rain or suffocating heat, until their minds broke and rebuilt themselves into something unrecognizable. Those who wept or fainted were not pitied. They were shamed. The philosophy of calm detachment was born not of peace but of exposure to relentless mental pain, the kind that stripped a person's will until only reflex and duty remained. To outsiders, the samurai's stoicism became the core of Japanese virtue, self-restraint, loyalty, devotion to duty. But few understood that these virtues were extracted through fear. Every samurai lived beneath the shadow of disgrace, knowing that one mistake, one moment of weakness, could demand ritual death as atonement. The sword, that perfect symbol of honor, was both protection and punishment. Its gleaming beauty hid the truth, that it was often turned inward, into the belly of the man who carried it. In this world, courage did not mean fearlessness. It meant submission, to hierarchy, to the code, to the annihilation of the self. The samurai's calm smile, so admired in art, was not the mark of wisdom but of someone who had learned to silence every part of himself that once felt pain. And yet, there was beauty in this madness. The silence, the control, the ritual, all were meant to transform chaos into grace. Pain became a pathway to purity, fear became meditation, and suffering became art. The Japanese aesthetic of wabi-sabi, which finds beauty in imperfection and decay, was born from this same tension, the struggle to find meaning inside destruction. Every droplet of blood spilled in training, every scar hidden under silk armor, was a step toward becoming something beyond human. The samurai believed that if they could conquer their minds completely, they could stand between life and death without fear, a living embodiment of nothingness. But what they called enlightenment might just as easily be called extinction. The man who had once felt joy, love, or sorrow disappeared behind ritual and silence. What remained was a weapon, a body of flesh guided by a will that no longer belonged to him. And that, perhaps, is the most haunting truth of all. The serenity we associate with the samurai was not peace, but the stillness that follows a slow and deliberate psychological death. It was beauty carved out of agony. It was the perfection of control achieved by erasing the soul beneath it. In the heart of samurai life stood an invisible prison, one built not from walls or chains but from words, honor, and silence. It was called Bushido, the way of the warrior. To outsiders, this code appeared noble and spiritual, the foundation of all that made the samurai admirable. But for those who lived within it, Bushido was both a religion and a curse. Every breath, every thought, every gesture was bound to a rigid moral structure that demanded absolute control. The samurai's mind was not his own. His emotions, his desires, even his fears were no longer private possessions. They belonged to his master, to his clan, to the unyielding code that ruled his existence. To live as a samurai was to live inside a psychological cage so beautifully constructed that many never realized they were prisoners at all. The first lesson of Bushido began in silence. From childhood, a samurai was taught to fear dishonor more than death. Shame was not a passing feeling, it was a form of social execution. To show cowardice or hesitation, to display emotion before superiors, was to be spiritually unclean. Children watched their elders bow deeply, speak softly, and conceal their true thoughts behind masks of politeness. They learned that the self was dangerous, that personal will was a form of rebellion. In the dojo, young trainees were beaten not only for mistakes in swordsmanship, but for failing to maintain perfect composure after being struck. The lesson was clear. Pain was acceptable, emotion was not. The ideal samurai was not fearless, he simply had no permission to feel fear at all. Over time, this silence became a second skin. A samurai could not cry when his comrades fell in battle. He could not tremble when facing overwhelming odds. He could not even express joy, for joy too was considered indulgent and undisciplined. Restraint became a performance, a theater of calm that masked storms beneath the surface. Those who failed to master this mask were punished through humiliation, a weapon far more devastating than physical pain. Public shame could destroy a family's name for generations. The idea of maintaining an image of perfect dignity, haunted every waking moment. Even in solitude, a samurai lived as though the eyes of his ancestors were upon him. The cage of honor had no door, no escape, not even in one's own thoughts. Some masters weaponized this code deliberately. They believed that true loyalty could only be achieved through psychological death. Apprentices were subjected to trials that stripped away pride and individuality. A master might insult his pupil before others, forcing him to endure ridicule without response. Another might demand that his student perform a meaningless task for weeks without question. These acts were not cruelty for its own sake. They were designed to test submission, to see whether the student's ego could survive humiliation. The ideal outcome was not rebellion but silence. When a samurai could accept insult and pain without emotion, his training was said to be complete. He had learned to bury himself beneath the mask. In this world, honor was not just a social rule, it was an internal tyrant. To be honorable was to live in constant self-surveillance. Every decision carried the weight of ancestral judgment. The samurai's sense of self-worth depended entirely on external validation, on how well he followed the invisible script of loyalty and obedience. If he failed, redemption could come only through death. This was the cruel paradox of Bushido. It claimed to elevate the soul, yet demanded self-destruction as proof of virtue. The fear of failure became a weapon sharper than any katana. It gnawed at the mind, whispering that disgrace was worse than pain, that the only escape from shame was blood. Even moments of peace were infected by this code. A samurai sitting in his garden, sipping tea, was not resting. He was practicing composure. Every motion, pouring water, folding the sleeve, breathing evenly, was an exercise in control. The ritual of the tea ceremony, often romanticized as meditation, was in truth a rehearsal for emotional stillness under pressure. The serenity seen in art and poetry was not natural tranquility, it was discipline honed to perfection. The samurai learned to treat every detail of life as a reflection of his inner order. But that order came at a terrible price. To maintain it, he had to suppress everything that made him human. There are accounts of warriors who broke beneath this pressure, who wept in secret or took their own lives after a single misstep. In their world, the line between devotion and madness was almost invisible. Some wrote poems moments before death, expressing gratitude for the chance to atone through suicide. Others spoke of emptiness, of feeling like shadows wearing armor. They did not fear dying in battle, they feared living with dishonor. The psychological burden of Bushido did not end with the individual, it infected entire families, teaching wives and children that their value depended solely on their ability to endure. Thus, suffering became hereditary, passed down like a sacred heirloom. To modern eyes, Bushido appears romantic, a code of dignity and courage. Yet when seen through the lens of the samurai's mind, it was something far darker. It turned emotion into guilt, weakness into sin, and silence into virtue. It was a system that perfected the art of repression, transforming living men into disciplined ghosts. The serenity that outsiders admired was not peace, it was paralysis. And within that paralysis, entire generations of warriors learned to equate humanity with failure. In the world of Bushido, Honor was a shining light that blinded as much as it guided. It demanded beauty in behavior, grace in death, and stillness in the face of terror. But beneath that stillness, the human heart screamed quietly, unseen and unheard, until it learned to stop making noise at all. What the samurai called discipline was, in truth, the art of becoming invisible, to others, to one's master, and finally to oneself. In the depths of samurai training, the human mind became both the battlefield and the weapon. Where the sword carved flesh, discipline carved the soul. The next stage of a warrior's transformation was not about physical endurance but the dissection of thought itself, a process so refined and merciless that it turned ordinary men into living paradoxes, perfectly calm yet utterly broken inside. This was the torture of the mind, an invisible torment designed to dissolve identity until only obedience remained. To the outside observer, it appeared as meditation, as serenity. In truth, it was psychological warfare, conducted against the self by the self, under the watchful eye of a master who would not tolerate hesitation. Every apprentice was taught early that the greatest enemy of a samurai was his own mind. Fear, doubt, and memory were weaknesses to be eliminated. Masters would whisper, "To conquer the sword, first conquer the soul." That conquest began through systematic mental dismantling. Young warriors were sent into isolation for days or weeks, forbidden to speak, move, or even sleep properly. They sat in cold, dark temples with nothing but a single candle flickering in front of them. The silence was so deep it became deafening, the kind that made one aware of every heartbeat, every twitch, every whisper of thought. The exercise's purpose was simple but cruel, to confront the mind until it shattered. Those who panicked were ridiculed. Those who endured were praised as closer to enlightenment. This was not meditation for peace, it was meditation as psychological crucifixion. At the center of this mental ordeal was the concept of mushin no shin, the mind without mind. The idea sounded spiritual, even poetic, but its path was brutal. A samurai was expected to reach a state where thought no longer interfered with action, where instinct ruled completely. To achieve that, every trace of individuality had to be erased. Masters often used methods that bordered on sadistic to force this transformation. A student might be blindfolded and attacked without warning by fellow trainees for hours, conditioned to react without thinking. Another might be made to practice sword cuts endlessly in silence until his arms trembled and his vision blurred. The goal was exhaustion, the moment where consciousness dissolved and muscle memory replaced thought. When the mind was finally emptied of fear, hesitation, or hope, the student would be praised. "Now you are beginning to see clearly." But what they saw was often darkness. Some trainees described hallucinations during prolonged meditation, shadows whispering, phantom screams echoing from the walls. Others spoke of a numbness that crept through the body until they could no longer tell where the flesh ended and the air began. Masters viewed these breakdowns as signs of progress. They called it the killing of illusion. In reality, it was the slow disintegration of the human psyche. The mind, deprived of sleep, emotion, and stimulation, began to fold in on itself. The process blurred the boundary between sanity and transcendence, until even pain began to lose meaning. There were other techniques, more direct and unsettling. Some schools used controlled humiliation as a form of enlightenment. A master might insult a student in front of his peers, strike him without warning, or mock his failures with calm detachment. The student's task was to remain silent, unmoved, and expressionless. The moment he flinched or looked away, training would begin again from the start. This form of emotional torture taught one thing above all else: the death of pride. Pride was considered the root of all illusion, the barrier separating man from perfect obedience. When the student finally stopped reacting altogether, when insult and praise felt identical, the master would bow slightly and whisper, "Now you are empty." Some schools pushed this emptiness further, blending Zen philosophy with military cruelty. In one exercise, apprentices were ordered to meditate beside the corpses of executed criminals for nights on end. They were told to watch decomposition, to inhale the stench of death until it no longer disturbed them. The lesson was simple: to kill without fear, one must first make peace with death. Yet what this ritual truly achieved was desensitization, a slow numbing of the senses that turned the sacred boundary between life and death into a mere abstraction. By the end, many claimed they could look into the eyes of the dead and feel nothing at all. Sleep deprivation was another weapon. Warriors were sometimes kept awake for 3 or 4 nights, forced to meditate or chant sutras until consciousness blurred into hallucination. The exhaustion produced visions, flashes of memories, distorted voices, or the illusion of floating outside one's body. Masters encouraged these moments, telling students that enlightenment often came when the self leaves the shell. In truth, these were symptoms of mental collapse. But collapse was precisely the goal. The samurai mind was to be stripped down and rebuilt from nothing, like a sword reforged after breaking. What emerged was a man who no longer questioned, no longer feared, and no longer dreamed. This transformation had its own mythology. The Zen concept of satori, sudden awakening, was often misunderstood in this environment. In the monasteries, satori meant realization through compassion and understanding. In the dojo, it became something colder. The moment a man realized that nothing in the world could hurt him because he no longer valued anything at all. Some trainees emerged from isolation laughing uncontrollably, others silent for days, their eyes empty. Masters saw these as signs of progress, proof that the student had died to himself. But many never recovered. Diaries written by retired samurai speak of recurring nightmares, voices in meditation, or an inability to feel joy. What the masters called enlightenment, the modern mind might call trauma. And yet, to the samurai, this suffering was sacred. They believed that only through destruction could true strength emerge. A warrior who conquered his mind was invincible, not because he was stronger but because he had nothing left to lose. The process was designed to extinguish fear completely, the fear of pain, of death, of disgrace, of life itself. When a man reached that point, he became something else, a being of pure instinct and duty. That was the ideal warrior, the perfect servant of his lord, the embodiment of Mushin. But beneath the perfection lay the ruin of a soul. To train the mind into silence was to amputate everything that made life meaningful. Love, grief, joy, doubt, all were sacrificed to the altar of discipline. The samurai who reached Mushin achieved what his masters desired, but at the cost of his humanity. His calmness in battle was not courage but emptiness. His serenity was not peace but vacancy. And when he looked into his reflection after years of training, perhaps he saw the truth that haunted every warrior. The only thing left behind the mask was nothing at all. Pain was never chaos in the world of the samurai, it was order. Every act of suffering, every test of endurance, every ritual of discipline followed a rhythm as precise as poetry. This was not random cruelty. It was choreography. The samurai did not merely endure pain, they performed it. Their torment was ritualized, transformed into theater, where agony became a form of spiritual art. Within this theater of pain, the mind was stripped, shaped, and polished until it reflected only the ideals of Bushido: composure, dignity, and beauty in suffering. What outsiders could never grasp was that behind every graceful bow and every calm death lay a stage designed for the performance of control. In training halls across feudal Japan, this theater played out daily. Apprentices knelt for hours in seiza, the formal sitting position with legs folded beneath the body, until the muscles in their legs turned to fire and the blood drained from their feet. Pain became a companion and immobility a teacher. If a trainee fainted or trembled, the master would strike him sharply on the back with a wooden stick to revive him and force him back into position. There was no sympathy, no pause. To move before being dismissed was to show weakness, to betray the illusion of serenity. The exercise was deceptively simple, but its purpose was profound: to train the body to obey the mind and the mind to obey the code. Every drop of sweat, every heartbeat echoing in silence, was a rehearsal for death, the moment when stillness itself became a weapon. This obsession with control extended beyond sitting and standing, it invaded every aspect of the warrior's body language. The samurai's movements were deliberate, ritualistic. Drawing the sword, bowing, or even wiping blood from the blade followed patterns rooted in centuries of etiquette. These actions were not meant for practicality alone, they were psychological reinforcement. Each ritual reminded the warrior that his body was no longer his own, but property of the code. In this way, physical discipline became mental programming. By repeating graceful gestures under conditions of pain, the samurai fused beauty and brutality into one. To falter in the ritual was to falter in one's soul. Among the most demanding tests of mental control was harajuai, literally, the art of the belly. This was not physical combat but the cultivation of intuitive perception and emotional suppression. A samurai was expected to sense deceit, danger, or hostility without words, reading the invisible energy of others. Masters trained this through psychological pressure. They would stare at a student for hours without speaking, radiating authority, testing how long he could hold his gaze without flinching. Others staged confrontations designed to provoke anger or shame, demanding that the student respond with perfect calm. To show emotion was failure, to remain still under insult was victory. Over time, this practice created men who could stand before an enemy, expressionless and yet radiate silent dominance. The lesson was cruelly simple: control others by first annihilating your own emotions. Then there was tamashigiri, the test cutting of blades, a ritual that fused craftsmanship, violence and psychological conditioning. A newly forged sword was often tested on bundles of straw, bamboo, or in darker cases, the bodies of executed criminals. Samurai who practiced tamashigiri were taught to cut cleanly, without hesitation, and to observe the result without reaction. The purpose went beyond testing steel; it tested the man. Could he watch flesh divide? Could he feel the resistance of bone beneath the blade and remain perfectly calm? Each strike was both practice and confession. The warrior who flinched was not ready. The one who smiled or trembled had failed. Only the man who cut without thought, without emotion, was praised as possessing the true heart of a samurai. In more extreme forms of training, samurai practiced self-inflicted endurance to test composure. Some would walk barefoot on snow, or hold burning incense to their skin during meditation. These acts were not punishments, they were prayers. Pain was believed to burn away impurities, revealing the soul's true shape beneath. There were even stories of warriors performing these acts before mirrors, forcing themselves to watch their own suffering without a flicker of expression. The mirror reflected not vanity but judgment. Could the warrior witness his humanity fading and remain still? The act of enduring without visible reaction became a declaration of transcendence, a moment where the man claimed mastery over nature itself. Every ritual of pain carried an audience, even when no one was physically present. The samurai lived as though watched by unseen eyes, by ancestors, spirits, and the endless lineage of those who had died before him. Their approval or disappointment was imagined but powerful. This constant sense of surveillance intensified the performance. A samurai's dignity was never private; it was a spectacle offered to history. Even in solitude he suffered as though the world were watching, for the world, his world of honor and memory, always was. The body became a stage, the soul a silent actor repeating lines written by the code centuries earlier. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of this performance was the calmness with which it was carried out. There was no shouting, no pleading, no visible defiance. In the dojo, a student might collapse from exhaustion, blood dripping from his knees as he bowed in apology for failure. The master would nod once, neither comforting nor condemning him, and command, "Begin again." This cycle of pain and repetition stripped the act of suffering of all emotion. Pain was no longer an experience, it was a duty. To endure was not heroic, it was expected. The absence of reaction became a new kind of perfection, one that blurred the line between strength and submission. Over time these rituals reshaped the samurai psyche. Pain no longer registered as punishment but as purification. Each test, each deliberate act of torment, served as a mirror of the soul's condition. The true terror of this system was not its cruelty but its beauty. The harmony of suffering was seductive. Masters described it as shibumi, the quiet elegance of restraint. To the Western mind, it might seem madness, to turn agony into art, humiliation into enlightenment. Yet within the samurai world that was the highest ideal. To die screaming was dishonor, to die silently with grace was salvation. The theater of pain was in truth the rehearsal for death. Every moment of stillness, every act of obedience, prepared the samurai for the final performance, when the stage would be a tatami mat, the audience his peers, and the act a ritual suicide performed without a tremor. In this way all training led to one lesson, that beauty lay not in living but in dying beautifully. Pain was never the enemy. It was the script. The samurai merely learned to play his role so perfectly that he forgot the suffering was real. The most terrifying lesson of samurai discipline awaited at the end of a warrior's life. It was called seppuku, ritual suicide, and it stood as the final test of everything a samurai was taught to believe. In its purest form, seppuku was not punishment but performance, a sacred ceremony in which the body became an altar and pain became confession. To the samurai, dying by one's own hand was not failure, it was mastery. It was the proof that discipline had triumphed even over the instinct to live. Every stroke of the blade, every breath drawn in agony, was an act of worship to the code that ruled him from birth. Yet beneath the elegance of the ceremony lay something unspeakable, a psychological mechanism so cold and absolute that it erased the boundary between faith and insanity. The ritual itself was simple in structure but immense in meaning. The samurai, dressed in white robes, would kneel on a tatami mat before witnesses, often his lord, comrades, or enemies. In front of him lay a short dagger, gleaming under candlelight. He would bow deeply, recite a poem that distilled his final thoughts, and then, with steady hands, insert the blade into his abdomen, slicing from left to right. If performed correctly, the cut was excruciating but deliberate, never rushed. The act symbolized purity through disembowelment, the physical opening of the body to expose the truth of the spirit. A chosen attendant, called a kaishikunin, stood behind him, sword drawn, ready to deliver a swift decapitating strike to end his suffering at the precise moment of collapse. This mercy stroke was itself an art, timed perfectly so the warrior's dignity remained intact. To outsiders the act appeared barbaric. But within the samurai world, it was the ultimate expression of control. To disembowel oneself without hesitation required a level of mental conditioning few could comprehend. The samurai who performed seppuku was not dying in despair. He was proving his loyalty, his courage, and his ability to remain composed at the threshold of death. In the moment when every nerve screamed for life, he maintained the ritual's calm precision. The blood spilled on the tatami was not viewed as tragedy but as testimony, that even in the face of unbearable pain, the mind could remain unbroken. Seppuku was the final exam in the lifelong education of psychological torment. But to reach this level of composure, a samurai had to be trained for years to face death as an intimate companion. From the first day of apprenticeship, boys were taught to visualize their own deaths daily. Masters instructed them to meditate on rotting corpses, to imagine their bodies lying unburied in rain or consumed by fire. The exercise was not meant to frighten but to desensitize, to dissolve the instinct for self-preservation. A warrior who no longer feared death could not be controlled by it. Ironically, this belief gave rise to a culture where control was everything and life was expendable. The samurai's identity depended on his willingness to die beautifully, not to live freely. There are stories of warriors rehearsing their own seppuku for months, bowing in front of the dagger, reciting farewell verses, even miming the motion of the cut. It was treated as an art form, practiced with the same devotion as swordsmanship or calligraphy. The difference was that the canvas would one day be their own flesh. They were expected to die with elegance, to hold the blade correctly, to cut cleanly, to keep the voice steady even as the body convulsed. Witnesses recorded cases of samurai apologizing for staining the tatami mats with blood, or smiling faintly to show courtesy before their heads were severed. In these moments, politeness became madness. The ritual transformed agony into aesthetic, turning death into a display of beauty so haunting it defied comprehension. Behind this performance was the cruel machinery of honor. Seppuku was not always voluntary. Many samurai were ordered to take their own lives as punishment for failure, disobedience, or political convenience. The command would come in the form of a written decree, delivered with impeccable formality. To refuse was unthinkable, it would disgrace one's family and condemn their descendants. Thus, even suicide became an act of social obedience. The condemned man would thank his lord for granting him the honor of dying by his own hand. He would bow, compose a death poem, and perform the ritual calmly, knowing that the alternative, public execution, would brand his name forever in shame. The horror of seppuku lay not only in its pain but in its elegance, in how completely it disguised despair as devotion. The psychological conditioning that made seppuku possible was built on years of silent torment. The samurai had been trained to see life and death as mirrors, each reflecting the same discipline. To live was to rehearse dying, to die was to perfect living. Masters told their pupils, the flower that blooms at dawn must accept to fall at dusk. It was a metaphor for detachment, for accepting impermanence. Yet in practice, it created a culture where self-annihilation was sanctified. Warriors came to believe that the only true control they could ever claim was over their own deaths. To die willingly was the ultimate act of freedom, yet also the final proof of the system's success. Eyewitness accounts from the Edo period describe the chilling calmness of these scenes. One observer wrote of a samurai who performed seppuku after being accused of disloyalty. He smiled, the witness said, and thanked his friends for the honor of their presence. When he cut his belly he did not scream, though his face turned the color of ash. He bowed once more before he fell. Another account speaks of a young retainer who performed the ritual so cleanly that his master wept, not for his death, but for the perfection of his form. These moments reveal the dark genius of samurai psychology. They had succeeded in transforming horror into harmony, violence into virtue. Yet the deeper truth of seppuku was not beauty, it was control. The ritual existed to maintain order through fear and shame. Every samurai knew that a life of dishonor would demand self-destruction, and so he lived each day in quiet anticipation of that possibility. This constant readiness to die produced an eerie calm, a peace born from inevitability. When a man knows his death is already decided, nothing can threaten him. The system turned mortality into a leash that the warrior willingly held around his own neck. In the end, seppuku became both a symbol and a sickness. It embodied the highest ideals of Bushido, loyalty, courage, composure, but also revealed the system's ultimate cruelty, that the only path to purity was through self-erasure. The samurai's greatest triumph was his final act of surrender, his ability to maintain beauty even in mutilation. And so, the ritual stood as the perfect reflection of his world, elegant, disciplined, and drenched in blood. Beneath the candlelight, as the blade cut through flesh, the samurai proved not that he was fearless, but that he had been perfectly, irrevocably conditioned to die without resistance. The next stage of psychological torment in samurai training was not about conquering fear of death, it was about erasing the capacity to feel compassion. The greatest threat to a warrior's resolve, masters believed, was empathy. Compassion was a crack in the armor of the mind, a dangerous seed that could grow into hesitation on the battlefield. And hesitation was fatal. Thus, the samurai were taught to treat mercy as a kind of poison, to purge it from the soul until killing became as natural as breathing. This was not merely training in violence, but an intimate and systematic destruction of humanity itself. The samurai were molded into instruments of perfect control, yet inside that control lay a silent tragedy. To serve honor, they first had to destroy the heart. It began early. Young apprentices were conditioned to suppress emotion from the moment they could hold a wooden sword. Acts of kindness were quietly discouraged. Displays of affection were met with stern correction. If a boy helped a weaker student or cried over a wounded animal, he might be punished, not harshly but with cold disappointment that cut deeper than any blow. Masters taught that compassion was a selfish indulgence, a distraction from duty. A sword that trembles cannot cut clean, they would say. Over time, the student learned to hide every flicker of empathy behind the same serene mask that hid his fear. What began as discipline became denial, a denial so complete that even the most natural instincts of care were replaced by ritualized calm. One of the most unsettling aspects of this mental conditioning was the practice of enforced obedience through emotional detachment. Some masters would order their students to kill small animals, birds, rabbits, even loyal dogs, to prove that sentiment no longer ruled them. The students were told to bow before the creature, to thank it for its spirit, and then to kill it swiftly without hesitation. The act was not cruelty for its own sake, it was training. The master would watch closely, not for the precision of the strike, but for the flicker in the student's eyes. A moment of sorrow or hesitation meant failure, a sign that the warrior was not yet ready for battle. The exercise taught one devastating truth: mercy could be practiced but never permitted. This erosion of compassion extended far beyond the dojo. On the battlefield, samurai were expected to kill without emotion, to see every death as necessary, even sacred. They were trained to view the enemy not as human, but as an obstacle to harmony, a disruption in the order that must be removed. Historical accounts describe samurai walking calmly among the dying after battle, offering water to none, stepping over bodies with ritual detachment. The killing itself was framed as an act of cleansing, a restoration of balance. The enemy's suffering became part of a larger moral symmetry, an illusion that allowed violence to feel virtuous. Through this logic, cruelty was not just tolerated, it was sanctified. There were psychological exercises designed to reinforce this moral inversion. Warriors were told to meditate after battle, not on victory but on the faces of those they had killed. They were instructed to breathe deeply, to quiet the mind, and to see the peace in their silence. By turning slaughter into serenity, masters ensured that guilt had no soil in which to grow. The more a samurai killed, the calmer he was expected to become. His soul was polished like steel, bright, beautiful, and incapable of reflection. In this emotional vacuum, obedience thrived. A man without compassion could never disobey, for he no longer recognized the humanity of those he served or those he destroyed. The samurai's own code reinforced this transformation. Bushido exalted loyalty above all else, and loyalty demanded the rejection of self. The warrior existed not to question but to execute. Mercy, like fear, was a luxury for lesser men. When a samurai raised his sword, he was told to imagine himself as a mirror reflecting his master's will, clear, flawless, and devoid of thought. If he hesitated, he betrayed the reflection. Many lived and died under this conditioning, their identities fused so completely with the code that even private emotion became treason. The mind was not simply disciplined, it was replaced. But within this silence, something else took root. A strange form of melancholy, the sorrow of those who could no longer feel sorrow. Diaries from the late Sengoku and Edo periods speak of warriors haunted by what they could not name. Some wrote that they dreamed of the faces of those they had killed, not as nightmares, but as empty visions, eyes staring without accusation, voices that never spoke. Others described feeling nothing when their own comrades died beside them in battle, a numbness that terrified them more than death itself. They had become perfect instruments of duty but hollow ones. The psychological torment of compassion denied was not chaos, it was emptiness, a void that consumed the soul in silence. There were moments, however, when cracks appeared. A samurai might encounter a child on the road, or a peasant's family begging for mercy, and feel a flicker of warmth, something ancient and forbidden. The code demanded that he suppress it instantly, yet that flicker could linger, buried deep, festering as guilt. Some sought redemption in religion, retreating into monasteries where their tears could finally fall unseen. Others sought purification through greater cruelty, hoping that each act of violence would erase the memory of the last. The paradox was endless. The more they killed to silence compassion, the louder that silence became. The psychological cost of this conditioning rippled far beyond the battlefield. The suppression of empathy created a society obsessed with formality, hierarchy, and emotional distance. Even in peacetime, samurai families lived by the same rules of restraint. Fathers rarely embraced their sons. Wives were expected to bow rather than speak of love. The household became a smaller stage for the same theater of control that ruled the dojo. Children grew up learning that tenderness was shameful, that strength meant silence. Thus, the emotional cruelty of samurai training became a cultural inheritance, one that still whispers beneath the surface of modern Japanese discipline and restraint. Yet even within this darkness, there was a twisted kind of beauty. The samurai's rejection of compassion was not born from hatred, but from an impossible pursuit of purity. They sought a world without weakness, a harmony undisturbed by emotion. They believed that love clouded duty, that pity diluted justice, and that peace could only exist when the heart was perfectly still. In that stillness they found their version of enlightenment, a silence so complete that even conscience disappeared. But what they called enlightenment was, perhaps, a different name for despair. In the end, the torture of compassion achieved what no blade could. It killed the human within the warrior while leaving the body standing. The samurai became symbols of grace and power, yet behind their calm eyes lingered ghosts, of mercy, of empathy, of the self they were forced to abandon. Their discipline was unmatched, their loyalty unquestioned, but their peace was an illusion. They lived in perfect balance between honor and emptiness, between beauty and cruelty, forever performing serenity while carrying the quiet sorrow of those who had forgotten how to feel. If the samurai's physical training was a trial of endurance and their psychological training a descent into control, then their spiritual education was the abyss itself, a place where pain became divine. This stage was not about killing others or even resisting death, it was about transcending humanity altogether. The masters believed that the perfect warrior must learn to dissolve the boundary between life and death, between self and nothingness. And to achieve that, he had to embrace suffering as sacred. Every wound, every scar, every moment of agony was a conversation with the gods. It was through pain that the samurai believed they could approach enlightenment, not through peace but through purification by torment. This belief was not born in isolation. It was rooted deeply in Japan's fusion of Shinto and Zen Buddhist philosophies. Shinto taught that spirits inhabited all things, the mountains, the rivers, the sword itself, and that harmony with these forces required purity of spirit. Zen, meanwhile, taught that enlightenment lay in emptiness, in detachment from worldly illusion. Together, they formed a paradox that shaped the samurai soul. To achieve peace, one must first destroy the self. The warrior was told that pain was the gateway to that destruction, a sacred test through which the illusions of comfort, identity, and fear were stripped away. The body became both temple and battlefield, and the only prayer was endurance. In this spiritual framework, suffering was not to be avoided, it was to be invited. Samurai were known to perform misogi, purification rituals that involved exposing themselves to freezing waterfalls in winter, fasting for days, or meditating motionless for hours in snow and silence. They called it polishing the mirror of the soul, scraping away weakness through hardship. Masters would say, if your body trembles, let it. It is your spirit that must remain still. The purpose was to learn how to separate the mind from the body, to watch pain as if it belonged to someone else. Through repetition, the warrior achieved a terrifying serenity. His body could be suffering, but his spirit would remain untouched. These rituals bordered on torture, yet they were performed with the calm precision of prayer. Warriors would kneel beneath waterfalls until their limbs went numb, chanting sutras as icy water pounded against their skulls. Others would meditate while holding painful positions for hours, their legs cramping, their spines shaking, but their faces unmoving. To interrupt meditation was disgrace. To faint was failure. Some would even slice their own skin lightly before meditation, using the sting as a reminder of impermanence, the truth that all things including pain would pass. The act was not self-harm in the modern sense, it was self-erasure. Each drop of blood symbolized another layer of the ego being washed away. The goal was to achieve mushin no shin, the mind without mind. In this state, the samurai moved and fought without thought, reacting purely from instinct and training, free from emotion or hesitation. To reach this condition required total psychological surrender. Pain, humiliation, exhaustion, all became tools to dismantle the illusion of the self. The samurai who mastered this no longer perceived battle as chaos. It became meditation in motion. The clash of swords, the screams of dying men, the spray of blood, all dissolved into stillness. The warrior became the weapon, and the weapon became the will of heaven. But there was a darker consequence to this enlightenment. In stripping away fear and ego, the samurai also stripped away compassion, doubt, and remorse. They transcended humanity, but in doing so, lost what made them human. A Zen monk once described the perfect warrior as a man who kills without anger and dies without grief. It was meant as praise, the image of one who had achieved ultimate peace. Yet hidden within that peace was something deeply unsettling, the transformation of pain into devotion, cruelty into grace. The samurai who had found serenity in slaughter was not enlightened, he was emptied. Some temples actively encouraged this transformation, teaching the warrior monks that to kill without hesitation was an act of mercy, ending illusion for both killer and victim. Historical texts describe monks blessing swords before battle, claiming they were tools of purification. The act of killing, when performed in absolute awareness, was believed to cleanse both souls, the one who died and the one who struck. This doctrine turned warfare into ritual, making spiritual detachment indistinguishable from moral indifference. Death became an offering to the gods of order, and pain a form of worship. The samurai carried this theology onto the battlefield. Before battle, they would kneel in silence, reciting poems that compared their fleeting lives to falling cherry blossoms, brief, beautiful, and destined to die. These verses were not expressions of despair, but of acceptance. The samurai saw death as an aesthetic experience, a final gesture of beauty in a world ruled by impermanence. To die gracefully without fear was the ultimate proof of mastery. This fusion of art and violence created the haunting poetry of their culture. Men who could compose verses about moonlight and blood in the same breath. Perhaps the most haunting example of this spiritual conditioning was the Zenjo, or death meditation. Before committing seppuku, many samurai were required to meditate until their minds were completely still. Witnesses described how some entered such deep states of calm that they seemed to transcend pain entirely. Even as they disemboweled themselves, their expressions remained serene. The body bled, but the mind floated above it. In that moment, suffering became divine theater, proof that the samurai had achieved the ultimate victory over flesh. The spectators too were expected to watch in reverent silence, as if attending a sacred rite rather than a death. Yet for all its elegance, this spirituality concealed a devastating psychological truth. The samurai's faith in suffering was a prison. By worshipping pain as purity, they made cruelty eternal. Every drop of blood spilled in the name of discipline reaffirmed the belief that agony was sacred. The rituals that were meant to free the mind instead enslaved it, chaining enlightenment to torment. And because this suffering was sanctified, it could never be questioned. The samurai learned to love their torment, to find peace in punishment, to mistake numbness for transcendence. Still, there were rare voices of doubt. Some Zen masters whispered that true enlightenment could never come through violence, that the samurai had misunderstood emptiness as erasure. One wrote, "He who sees nothing in pain has blinded his own heart." But such teachings were dangerous. The warrior class was built upon the mythology of beautiful suffering, and to deny it was to unravel the order that held their world together. So the silence remained. The waterfalls continued to roar over bowed heads. The chants continued beneath the sound of steel. And the samurai, bound by both faith and fear, continued their devotion to pain, believing that through torment they might touch eternity. In the end, the samurai's gods were not cruel, They were reflections of the human mind, its hunger for control, its longing for meaning in agony. The warriors who sought purity through suffering found not enlightenment, but a haunting mirror of their own discipline, flawless, cold, and unfeeling. The ritual pains that shaped them did not lead to transcendence but to transformation, into beings who looked human, spoke poetry, and fought like demons, serenely indifferent to their own humanity. And thus, through pain, the samurai achieved their final paradox. They conquered fear, mastered death, and in the process, lost their souls to silence. By the time the samurai reached the highest level of discipline, there was almost nothing left within them that could break. Pain had been sanctified, compassion erased, fear dissolved, and identity dissolved into the stillness of duty. What remained was something beautiful and terrible, a human machine that had turned obedience into an art form and cruelty into serenity. This was the final evolution of the samurai mind, the death of mercy. To modern eyes it seems monstrous. Yet to the samurai, this state of being represented perfection. They believed they had ascended beyond emotion, beyond hesitation, beyond all earthly weakness. But in truth what they had achieved was a quiet extinction of the human soul. The samurai lived in a moral landscape where cruelty was not the opposite of honor, it was its companion. In a world governed by the Bushido Code, the sharpest sword was not the one that killed swiftly but the one that disciplined the spirit. Mercy, they were told, was indulgence. Compassion was decay. A warrior's strength was measured not by how many lives he saved, but by how little his heart wavered when he took them. It was said that a perfect samurai could strike down even his own brother if ordered, without question, without sorrow. This was not metaphorical. Historical records describe instances of samurai forced to execute their comrades or even their sons as tests of loyalty. If they hesitated, their own lives would end in ritual suicide. In one notorious account from the Sengoku period, a general demanded that a samurai prove his devotion by killing his best friend, a fellow warrior who had fought beside him for years. The man obeyed. After delivering the fatal blow, he bowed to the corpse and said softly, "Forgive me for this act of duty." The general, impressed by his composure, promoted him on the spot. To the samurai this was not cruelty, it was grace. To die or to kill without emotion was the purest expression of discipline. But to an outside eye, it was madness given form, a moral inversion so complete that it transformed love into sin and murder into virtue. This moral death was reinforced not only through acts of violence but through ritualized indifference. Samurai were trained to view suffering as natural, even necessary. When a subordinate was punished, his screams were not cause for pity but for reflection, a reminder of what happened when control faltered. Masters would sometimes order floggings, amputations, or forced isolation as lessons for others to observe. No one intervened, no one protested. The silence of witnesses was part of the ritual. It was not cruelty in their minds, it was order. Every lash, every drop of blood had meaning. The samurai world functioned on the belief that pain preserved purity, that mercy invited chaos. And so, the absence of compassion became a virtue celebrated as restraint. But this restraint had a hidden cost. Beneath the calm exteriors, many samurai lived lives of quiet despair. Diaries from the Edo period reveal glimpses of this inner conflict. Men who described feeling trapped between duty and conscience. One wrote, "I am praised for killing without hesitation, yet in dreams I still hear their voices." Another confessed that he envied peasants for their freedom to weep. These were forbidden emotions, suppressed by ritual and rank, but they still leaked through in poetry and prayer. The beauty of samurai literature, its elegance, its melancholy, its obsession with fleeting moments, was the only outlet left for the mercy they were not allowed to express. The brush became a substitute for the heart. As the centuries passed and peace replaced constant warfare, the cruelty of samurai discipline did not fade, it simply turned inward. Deprived of battle, warriors turned their blades upon themselves in more subtle ways. They imposed impossible standards of honor, perfection, and control. A single misstep, a word spoken out of turn could demand seppuku. Some committed suicide over minor insults or imagined failures. Others starved themselves in penance for emotions they could not suppress. The cruelty of war had become the cruelty of conscience. The same discipline that once sustained them on the battlefield now devoured them in peace. This psychological collapse was inevitable. A code built on the denial of mercy could not sustain the living, only the dying. The samurai had learned to exist without empathy, to obey without question, and to suffer without complaint. But in doing so they had lost the ability to forgive themselves. The perfection they pursued was an illusion, a mirror that reflected only emptiness. The most tragic irony was that the virtues they prized most, loyalty, purity, self-control, became the tools of their own destruction. A samurai could defeat any enemy except the silence inside his own mind. In this silence, cruelty began to take on a spiritual flavor. Pain became not just a method but a meaning. Masters spoke of suffering as the fire that tempers the soul. Disobedience, weakness, or even emotion were sins to be purified by punishment. The body was no longer simply flesh, it was an altar where discipline was proven through endurance. Some warriors would voluntarily endure pain to reaffirm their strength, kneeling on stone floors for hours, holding their arms above burning candles, fasting until their vision blurred. These acts were private, unseen by others, performed not for glory but for absolution. They sought to burn away every trace of humanity until only devotion remained. And yet, beneath this perfection, something monstrous was born. When a man learns to feel pride in his suffering and peace in cruelty, he becomes untouchable, not because he is strong but because he is broken beyond repair. The samurai's world had elevated this brokenness into beauty. The perfect warrior was not the one who loved honor, but the one who became indistinguishable from it. His soul was polished into a mirror so flawless that it reflected nothing, no joy, no pity, no doubt. That was the true death of mercy, the moment when even the thought of compassion vanished from consciousness. But even this perfection could not endure forever. History would eventually betray the samurai. When the Meiji Restoration came in the late 19th century, the new government outlawed seppuku, stripped the warriors of their swords, and declared the Bushido Code obsolete. For the first time in centuries, the samurai were told that their suffering had no meaning, that their loyalty was no longer sacred. Many could not bear this. Deprived of their identity, they faced an emptiness greater than any battlefield. Some took their own lives in protest. Others faded into obscurity, ghosts of a discipline that had consumed them. The empire they had built from obedience no longer needed them, and so they disappeared, leaving behind only legends and silence. In that silence lies the final truth of their torment. The samurai's cruelty was not born from evil, but from devotion. They believed that mercy weakened the order of the world, that discipline was sacred even when it destroyed the soul. Their lives were poems written in blood, beautiful, symmetrical, and tragic. And though their swords have long rusted, the shadow of their philosophy lingers. It can be seen in every culture that glorifies sacrifice over compassion, control over feeling, order over life itself. The death of mercy is not confined to the past. It is a mirror held up to the human desire for perfection, a reminder that in trying to rise above our humanity, we risk falling beneath it. So when we look upon the samurai, their flawless armor, their calm faces, their legendary discipline, we must see beyond the beauty. Beneath it lies the ultimate cost of their devotion, the transformation of men into monuments, of pain into prayer, of cruelty into virtue. The samurai did not simply live by the sword, they became it, cold, sharp, and unfeeling. And in the end, their greatest victory was also their greatest tragedy. They conquered mercy itself. As the sun set on the age of the samurai, their swords were sheathed for the final time, but their spirit did not die. It sank deeper into the heart of a nation that still revered silence, discipline, and sacrifice. The torments that once trained warriors became invisible traditions of endurance, reshaped into modern virtues. To suffer quietly, to obey without question, to die with dignity, these ideals endured long after the battles ended. Yet beneath this beauty lay the same ancient truth, that honor built on pain can never bring peace. The samurai sought purity through torment, control through suffering, and perfection through denial, and in doing so they lost the softness of being human. Their story stands as both warning and wonder, proof that strength without compassion turns sacred duty into silent despair. Today their legacy survives not in armor or blades, but in the tension between control and emotion that defines us all. The lesson they left behind is simple, that the greatest victory is not mastery over pain, but mercy toward oneself.